Hello and welcome to this episode of the Critical Whole Training Podcast, where we're going to be talking about the lower back. We're going to talk about injuries, we're going to talk about avoiding exercises, and we're going to talk about low back strengthening. I've broken this episode up into 3 parts. Part number 1 is talking about injury mechanisms. Part number 2 is talking about avoiding exercises, or why you should avoid some exercises and you don't need to avoid other exercises, and how to bring back in exercises that you were once avoiding that you now know you now don't need to avoid anymore. So there's a little bit of a complexity to that one, but I will explain that when we get closer to it. And then finally, we'll talk about low back strengthening as a whole, because there are some misconceptions about it. There are also misconceptions about injury mechanisms and the avoiding of exercises, because I get comments all the time about telling me about how wrong I am about certain exercises, about how you shouldn't avoid certain exercises and they should be essential. But there is context and there is nuance to that, because there is some truth in what they're saying. But if you delve a couple of layers deeper, you start to understand that there is a falsehood to what they are saying as well, and that kind of needs to be understood as well. And then you're able to make a better decision with regards to the injury that you have to the lower back, the exercises to choose for that, and then how to go about strengthening it after, which is what this podcast episode is all about. So without further ado, we'll get stuck into part number 1, which is mechanisms. So injury mechanisms. Now, what is an injury mechanism? Well, first of all, let's look at what a mechanism is. It's a natural or established process by which something takes place or is brought about. Now, when it comes to low back injury mechanisms, we have to start off broad and then we can start getting a little bit more specific. Now, most low back injuries are not like when you break a bone. So, as an example, you can get stress fractures, which can lead to certain injuries, but like a traumatic injury. So let's just say you fall, or you get hit by something, and you break a bone in your arm. It's very clear to see the cause of that exercise. You had a fine arm before, you fell or you got hit, then there was a lot of pain, you had an x-ray, and there is a break there. So that is very clear to see that impact of falling or getting hit caused that break. So that's a very easy injury mechanism. Falling, or the traumatic impact, that was the injury mechanism that broke the bone. Low back injuries aren't like that. Low back injuries are a little bit more complex, because whenever you learn about most low back injuries, they get shoved into a category called non-specific. And non-specific says we don't know what the cause is. So basically, we don't know what the mechanism is. Now, through a process of questioning, so in a consultation, asking questions, and going through a physical assessment, you can start to pick up people's injury mechanisms. And I also want to introduce another sort of category of low back pain, and it's mechanical lower back pain, which basically means there is a movement aspect to your pain. And through that questioning and consultation, through that assessment, we are able to pick up mechanical injury mechanisms, because they can be explained, and they can also be assessed. So we can start to pick that up and start to draw a picture of specific mechanisms. Now, obviously, that takes time, and what we have to be able to do is be as specific as we can to be able to get to that. Now, that's sort of like the first part of understanding low back injury. The second part is what would be described as micro traumas. Now, the example that I used with the impact, so getting hit or falling and then a break occurs, that's a traumatic injury. It happened in one moment. With micro traumas, they happen in many little moments, but they accumulate. Micro traumas accumulate, the tissues fatigue, and then the tissues give up, basically. So we have to understand this idea, or it's not even an idea, this mechanism of micro trauma accumulation and then back pain happening. Once we can get used to that, we can start to understand that there is a movement aspect, a mechanical aspect to lower back pain. Because all movement, if not done well, so a technical aspect to it, so a good technique aspect to it, if there is not a good technique aspect to movement, microtraumas will accumulate. If there is a lot of movement, be it good or bad, but bad movement is going to accelerate the process that much more because of the stresses on the joint and on the tissues of the joint. But if there is just a constant accumulation of these microtraumas through too much movement without adequate recovery, then again an injury is going to happen. So we have a quality of movement part to it, and we have a quantity of movement part to it. So it's all about these microtraumas building up. And you can look up microtraumas. Microtraumas are in many, many injuries. Back pain is one of them. Disc failure is due to microtraumas. Spondylolisthesis is down to microtraumas. Back spasms, microtraumas. So they just start popping up everywhere. So there is a build-up. So with regards to the sort of, let's just quickly introduce the rehabilitation of microtraumas. They need to be recovered. So there needs to be some sort of recovery process. So not doing too much movement. You can do a lot of movement, but you have to have a lot of recovery to go with it to allow the microtraumas to heal so they don't accumulate and then create an injury. As I mentioned, there is a quality technique thing to it. If you have good technique, but you do far too much of it without adequate recovery, tissues will fail, or tissues can fail. If you do lots of poor quality movement, then again, tissues can fail. And as a general rule, they will fail more quickly. And then you get pain more quickly. So it doesn't matter whether you have good or bad technique, it can happen if you don't recover. That's sort of the caveat to it. If you have good quality movement, if you recover well, then you're in the greatest, you have the greatest chance of preventing injury. Now, there is never 100% prevention because modern life isn't set up for health, let's say. Too much sitting for most people. If you sit a lot and then go to the gym, you kind of go from one extreme to another. So that's sort of an unhealthy process because you go from one extreme to the other. So that can be a problem. Again, there are caveats to that before you jump on that saying, I'm saying people shouldn't exercise. People should exercise, but there is a way to exercise so you don't go from one extreme to another, is what I'm saying. So again, there's nuance, there's context, there's caveats to it. So please don't take what I'm saying out of context. So with regards to injury mechanisms, what we have to understand with the lower back is that they accumulate, they hit a tipping point, and then we get pain. So this includes everything. All exercises, all movements, So I've always described low back pain as a condition of the lower back. It is a poor condition of the lower back when you have pain. If you have low back pain, you have a poor condition to your lower back. If you don't have pain, you have a better condition. It doesn't mean it's a good condition, it's a better condition. Because it could be that you're just sitting way, like the tipping point, if you hit there, then you're going to get pain. But your level may be there. Someone else's level may be up here. Someone else's level may be up here. So they've got a big margin of error. So that's another sort of part to this, which is about margin of error. If you have lower back pain, you have a small margin of error. Because if you do one thing wrong, bang, your back goes. If you are able to work yourself out of that, you create a margin of error where you may be able to do a few things wrong, your back condition goes down, but then you recover and it comes back up. And you still have that margin of error, but you dipped into your margin of error and then came back out of it. And obviously, the people with the greater margin of error will have the better condition of their lower back, and they will be at a more reduced risk of back injury. So it's a complete sort of re-understanding of injury and how they come about, because what we don't want is these micro traumas to build up. So what we have to be able to do is be able to get a good condition of the lower back, and if we can create that good condition, what we are then able to do is have a much better experience with our lower back, and that allows us to experiment with more exercises. So what we'll do in the next part is we'll now start introducing exercise into this condition of the lower back and low back injury and low back pain. Now that we've got this idea of lower back pain being a condition of the lower back, and it's not like a bone break that just happens in one moment and we get pain, it's an accumulation of injuries, and a better condition to the lower back has a greater margin of error. A painful back has a lesser margin of error. Now that we've got that, we can now start introducing exercise into the equation. Now, as I mentioned at the end of the last part, when we have a good condition to the lower back, we can experiment with more exercises. When we have a poor condition to our lower back, i.e. it's in pain, we are more restricted with regards to the exercises that we can do, and I'm going to explain why that is. Now, I mentioned back in the last section about the mechanical aspect to lower back pain, so the movement aspect to lower back pain. Now, that could be through a process of assessment. It could be discovered that someone has a flexion intolerant spine. And what that basically means is when the spine is flexed, pain occurs or pain is triggered. So it's most advantageous to remove that movement or that posture from the spine. Now, we do that when you have a small margin of error. If you have a big margin of error, like me, I suffered with lower back pain. I now don't suffer with lower back pain. I am now sat and my spine is rounded. I have a larger margin of error. So my back and the condition of my back can cope with being in a flexed posture and I don't get pain. I used to get pain, but I don't anymore. So now I have a larger margin of error. But when I had back pain, I didn't have a large margin of error. I couldn't sit in a car for very long and I would drop into pain. I would have to then stop the car, get out, walk around, get out of that flexed posture, get back in the car, be out of pain, and then complete the rest of my journey. Or if it was long enough, the pain would drop back in. I would then get back out, get out of the pain, so on and so forth. So I had a small margin of error. Now, when we talk about avoiding exercises, We only talk about avoiding exercises because, one, we've identified that flexion triggers your pain or triggers the pain. So what we basically say, well, okay, if it triggers the pain, let's just take it out. Let's build up the margin of error. And then what will happen once we've built the margin of error up, because we haven't kept triggering the pain, we've built up the margin of error, that then allows us to bring spine flexion in or spine rotation or whatever it may be. So when we talk about avoiding exercises, it's not to say that this is a bad exercise. It's to say, at the moment, for you, in your current situation, this is a bad exercise. Now, a lot of people take that out of context and think that I'm saying it's a bad exercise. And when I say, as an example, back extensions are a mechanism of low back injury, so are a lot of other exercises, so are a lot of other movements, so are a lot of other postures. But if you have a small margin of error and your back doesn't like spine flexion, or we've found out that your back doesn't like spine flexion and it drops you into pain, then take it out, avoid it. Now, on the other side of that, when we talk in part 3 about strengthening the back, there are plenty of other good exercises that will strengthen the back, that do exactly what the back extension does, but it doesn't take you through that flexion and extension cycle. Because the flexion and extension cycle created the problem in the first place. Or flexion created the problem in the first place. And the back extension does that. So there are inherent ways, movements, postures that the low back can get injured. And it's within everything. It's within the neutral spine, because if you overload the spine in neutral, you're going to create an injury. There is no getting away from it. But it's how you manage the condition of your lower back. If you've had a history of flexion intolerance, your spine gets painful when you go into flexion, and then you come back and start doing back extensions. If you've got a huge margin of error and you don't overcook them, then fine. But you won't know that you've overcooked it until you get the pain. So all I'm saying is we know that flexion is the problem. We know that the back extension is flexion, or has flexion, and other exercises have flexion. We know that we need to build up a margin of error, but we also know that we don't know where we are within that, because we haven't got a little sort of screen that gives us the margin of error that we're using within our lower back. So all I'm saying is, because we don't always know these things, it's most useful to choose another exercise and just manage the load, because the neutral posture spreads the load. That's well documented. Flexed postures concentrate load. So if we concentrate load, we're going to be concentrating load in a specific area, creating more micro traumas even faster, and then creating a poorer condition of the lower back. If we stay in a neutral, now again, that doesn't mean that we need to stay there all the time 24/7. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, if you spend most of your time, let's just use exercising as the example, if you spend most of your time in the neutral posture, you're going to be spreading the load around. If you do loads of sit-ups and back extensions and deadlifts with a rounded spine, then you're going to be concentrating it all in an area and increasing your risk. When you do it in neutral, you just reduce your risk. You don't prevent, you just reduce, because there are lots of other factors. It's multifactorial lower back pain, and we need to get most of these factors working in our favour. And neutral spine is a helpful way of doing that. Strengthening your spine in flexion, I haven't really found anything useful to back that up. All that is training your spine like your bicep. We need to train the elbow through full range of movement and the bicep through full range of movement. That comes from bodybuilding. That's not functional. That's not necessarily healthy exercise. So it's trying to understand it in that way. So to summarise what I've talked about here, avoiding exercises is very specific to the individual, and it's very specific to the mechanism of injury. And it doesn't mean that you have to avoid it forever. It just means you need to build up your margin of error, and then you can introduce it back in if you so choose. But you won't ever know where you are on that margin of error scale, if you will. You don't know whether you're close to pain, you don't know whether you're further away from pain. The only indication you will get from that is how frequently you get your lower back pain. So I haven't had lower back pain in many years. So in my head, I would think, okay, I've got a decent margin of error. I manage my back well. I don't put it necessarily in compromised positions. I reduce the load on it as best I can, and I haven't had pain in 10 years. Whereas in my late teens and early 20s, I would regularly get back spasms, which told me that I had a small margin of error, because a couple of times a year it would drop under that and I'd get my back spasm. But over time I've been able to sort of get that out, and I haven't had any back spasms. I do get bits of tightness because I cycle. I'm not in a neutral position when I cycle. It's a terrible position for the lower back because your spine is flexed, your hips don't extend. So you're constantly sort of managing that, which can create muscle ache. It's not necessarily a lower back problem, it's just a muscle ache. Massage it out, stretch it out, and it's absolutely fine. So there are lots of different ways, but it's understanding your lower back, your mechanisms, so you're able to build a margin of error so you can include as many exercises back in as you so choose. Part 3 is back strengthening, and now we've got sort of a better understanding of the injury mechanisms and avoiding exercises. We can start talking about strengthening the lower back and kind of bring a bit more context to why I say the back extension is an unnecessary exercise. There are lots of other options out there that do the same job, if not a better job. And they put less load and strain through the lower back. So it seems more advantageous to do these other exercises. Exercises like glute bridges, good mornings. I mean, deadlifts is a great exercise with proper position of the spine. That would be included as a good sort of back strengthening, low back strengthening exercise. And any exercise really where you maintain that neutral posture, because you're developing hip flexion, which is a hip hinge, which is accessing the glute medius. Now, why do I glute maximus, glute medius, glute minimus? Now, why do I say maintain the neutral posture? If you look at the anatomy of the lower back, you'll see that there is a big fascial sheath that goes across it. It's essentially the same as the abdominal fascia, but it's called the thoracolumbar fascia or the lumbodorsal fascia. Essentially, our body is one big fascial sheath with muscles dotted around it. Now, the muscles are there, certainly with the lower back. What they want to do is they want to pull the thoracolumbar fascia taut. That stabilizes the lumbar vertebra. When you go into flexion, it shuts that off. When you go into flexion, the glutes don't work as well because you don't need them to work as well because the spine's doing the movement, not the hips. You also lengthen a lot of the erector spinae muscles, which again shuts them off, which allows stress to go into that area. When we maintain the neutral posture, we neutralize anterior shear forces on it. We have glute maximus working more effectively. We have the longissimus and iliocostalis working more effectively. We have the abdominals working more effectively. And what this is doing, this is pulling taut on the thoracolumbar fascia. So we're not necessarily training the lower back. We are training the torso and the hips. And that supports the lower back and gives strength to it, although that's probably not the right way to describe it because it's not a low back strengthening, it's a torso strengthening, and then the lower back is a part of the torso, and that raises up in and of itself. So again, if you have a lower back problem and you are training the lower back, you are missing sort of 90% of what needs to be worked. And it doesn't mean that if you do an ab session that that's helping your lower back, because you're training them in separation. You want to try and integrate all of these parts of the lower back. You want the hips in, you want the abdominals in, you want the lateral musculature, the QL, the oblique. You want all of this included in that. Because as I've mentioned, when you maintain that neutral posture, you spread load. When you activate more muscles, again, that absorbs more of that load. So it takes it away from the lower back, reducing the accumulation of those microtraumas, keeping your margin of error up, maintaining a better condition to the lower back. So when we talk about strengthening the lower back, we're not really strengthening the lower back. We're strengthening the hips and the torso, and the lower back is just one piece of that puzzle. So what we are trying to do is, certainly when it comes to lower back pain, first of all, understand the mechanism of that injury. Secondly, try and take that mechanism away, build up the margin of error. Then you can start including more exercises, more movements, more postures, more positions that could be considered a problem. But because you've got a big margin of error, it's not that much of a problem. Once we've built out that and we've got a greater movement library to your body again, we then start building in strengthening exercises. But again, we're not strengthening the lower back. We are strengthening the torso and the hips, because that supports the whole area, reduces the risk of injury or reduces the microtrauma accumulation, which maintains a greater margin of error. So it's a very different way to look at lower back pain. It's a very different way to look at its rehabilitation, because it's not, as I mentioned, it's not that traumatic injury that just needs time to heal and then we're better. And it's also not using the bodybuilding sort of idea of reductionism and training specific muscles to be strong, because that's a bit of a misconception that once specific muscles are strong, that joint is strong and healthy. That's a misconception, because there are plenty of strong people out there with a bad back. So by definition, they should be okay because they're very strong. But that's not the case. My other question to that is, how strong do they need to be? And again, there's no sort of evidence to say your lower back needs to be X amount strong and then it's healthy. That's not, there's no information out there, and that's not a thing. So it's very much getting the condition of the body healthy. And then you've got a greater margin of error, which allows you to do more, which allows you to make more mistakes and doesn't create pain. So hopefully that gives you a better idea of what lower back pain is and does, how it's manifested, how it's rehabilitated. If you do have any questions, leave them in the comment section below. If you've enjoyed this content, hit the like button. If you've learned something new, hit the thanks button. And if you want to watch more like this, please do hit the subscribe button and the bell icon.